Hi, everyone, and welcome to this year's conference, Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse. And thank you so much to Elaine and her crew for continuing to promote the science and research of parental alienation. As people on the front lines dealing with this, we sincerely appreciate all of the support. So I am Dr. Mary Alvarez, and my presentation is entitled Parental Alienation is a Form of Child Psychological Abuse. However, before proceeding into the main topic, let me just give you a little sense of who I am and how I got to become involved in this field. I have about 20 years experience with high conflict family law matters. I was a custody evaluator for 15 of those 20 years. So I've seen the very worst, family situations that involve parental alienation and the heartbreak, that it creates. Currently, I'm working with mild and moderate parental alienation in parenting interventions and a lot of prevention work. The field is shifting now towards trying to create ways for these families to not end up in severe alienation situations, because by that point, lots of damage has already been done to the child and the parent-child relationship. So again, my colleague and I work with mild and moderate alienation, and we have a separate set of programs called Resetting the Family, in which we approach the mild and moderate alienation cases. So that's just a little bit about me. Here's what I would like to accomplish with everyone. My agenda is to first kind of get off the table this issue of justified estrangement, because that comes up on a regular basis by people who don't believe the science and research concerning parental alienation, which at this point is very solid. It's no longer a debate that there is something called parental alienation. So we'll talk about that to differentiate it from true bona fide parental alienation. Then I do want to go through with you the various definitions of child abuse, because now we consider alienation to be child abuse, and there's different definitions from different organizations, from the world level to the federal level to the state level. So just to help you understand that it still talks about the same thing, but there's different ways that people approach it depending from which direction you're looking. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why do parents engage in parental alienation, and help you understand some of the differences between parents who are able to kind of right the ship from parents who won't, can't, or a combination of both. And no matter what you do, the alienation will continue. Why do parents commit child abuse is another topic. And then what are potential psychological and neurodevelopmental consequences for children? So I want to kind of finish up with kind of the whole spectrum, from justified estrangement into the psychological abuse, into what we understand and know about parents and their role and their pathology. And then finally, this is what we're looking at can happen if we don't create a way to intervene much earlier in the alienation spectrum. Okay, so let's start with justified estrangement. Let's talk a little bit about some valid reasons that children might reject a parent. This information comes from research from Freeman 2020. So with justified estrangement, there has to be a valid, verifiable reason that a child might reject or resist contact or a relationship with a parent. And here are some of the findings from Freeman. Developmentally normal preference for one parent over the other. And what that means is some children are just characteristically or temperamentally similar to one parent than the other parent, and they have a better fit. So it doesn't mean that they reject the other parent, they just prefer one parent. Anxious and depressed children may also prefer one parent due to the nature of feeling sad and or anxious, and one parent may meet those needs better than the other. Defiant children may also align with one parent over another parent, especially if that parent is the one to not enforce the rules, not implement consequences, etc. Of course, defiant children are going to prefer the parent who allows them much more latitude. in their behavior. Some children have a parent who was absent. Maybe that parent was incarcerated. Maybe that parent just walked away from the family. And so there would be a justifiable reason that that child would be hesitant to have a relationship with that other parent because he or she doesn't really know that other parent. And then Freeman also talked about something called a shared delusional disorder. And what that means is if one parent has severe psychopathology or psychological disorders, that child can become encapsulated in the parent's pathology and assumes the same pathology as the parent. This, in this case, being delusions. And so the parent having delusions, then the child adopts the same delusions and comes to believe them. For example, that one parent is bad, scary, to be feared. So let's talk a little bit now about physical abuse, okay? Because my presentation will focus on psychological abuse, but let's talk about physical abuse in this issue of justified estrangement, because this is one argument that people make who do not believe in the concept of parental alienation. However, I'm going to present to you some research that shows that, for example, physically abused children maintain strong emotional bonds to their abusive parent. And that comes from Blizzard and Blum, 1994. A much more recent study found that 84% of moderate to severely physically abused children from New York State demonstrate attachment behaviors towards the abuser, meaning they still want a relationship with the abusive parent because it's biologically unnatural to reject a parent, even under abusive conditions. So that study came from Baker and Miller in 2019. So the explanation for why children still want a relationship, even with an abusive parent, verified physical abuse, is attachment theory. Because children need to be protected from various things in life. They just don't have the skills or the abilities to take care of themselves. And so they have to rely on their parental figures, even if that figure is abusive. And that helps explain why children still want that relationship. They just don't want the abuse. What about children who have been sexually abused? We know that sexually abused children also maintain strong emotional bonds to their abusive parent. Why would that be? Well, parents who concurrently abuse the child yet protect the child in other ways and feed and clothe the child blur the lines between abuse and non-abuse. And again, children are dependent on parents. And so that connection to them is very strong despite being abused. If they don't have another option, they cannot live independently. So emotional abuse, as in the other ways to abuse a child physically or sexually, emotionally abused children don't reject their parent regularly either. The explanations for that statement: when a child's needs were consistent with the abuser's needs, the emotional abuse decreased. So if the child could figure out how to align with that parent in a way that decreased the abuse, that's what they would do. And children don't have contempt for their abusive parent. They long for acceptance. They want to be loved. They want to be accepted. They want to be taken care of. And again, the notion of attachment is a hardwiring in all of us. We are all hardwired to attach to our primary caregivers. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to go against that kind of deep-seated biology. So in summary, my little piece here about justified estrangement: children don't like to be abused or mistreated. True. Children want the parental abusive behavior to stop. That's also the case. But a child's basic needs and desires to be accepted and loved promote his or her desire to attach and have a relationship with the primary caregivers. They also have some ambivalence about the relationship. And this is the key factor that differentiates justified estrangement from parental alienation. All right. Children reject a parent when they've been influenced by outside forces and factors, such as adults. So let me just reiterate my third point on this previous slide. Many children who have been abused show ambivalence about the abusive parent and still want a relationship with that parent. It's the lack of ambivalence about the parent that strongly suggests parental alienation, adult influence in the child's rejection of a parent. Because even abused children have ambivalence. Want the relationship, don't want the abuse. Not sure I really, really want a relationship, but I think I do. Don't want the abuse. That's ambivalence. All right, so let's move into psychological child abuse. What does that mean? Well, let's start with the U.S. federal law from the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act from 2010. So according to our own federal government, child abuse and neglect are any recent act or failure to act on the part of the parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. And parental alienation fits well within that definition. All right, because if a parent is not protecting the child's emotional or psychological development, that is considered child abuse, especially when they exploit the child using parental alienation tactics in order to effectuate revenge on the other parent, or some other strategy that the alienating parent has against the other parent. Now, I am from the state of Texas, so I pulled up the Texas Family Code and am going to introduce you to child abuse from a legal perspective. Each state would have a very similar definition of child abuse in your particular state's statutes. But here in Texas, under Chapter 261 of the Family Code, abuse includes the following acts or omissions by a person. So under A, it reads, mental or emotional injury to a child that results in an observable and material impairment. And we know through the research on toxic stress that that is an injury caused by alienation, can be caused by alienation. Impairment in the child's growth, development, or psychological functioning. Again, we know through the research that psychological disorders occur in higher frequencies in children who have been alienated, both during childhood as well as into adulthood. B, under this particular family code, causing or permitting the child to be in a situation in which the child sustains a mental or emotional injury, which we know parental alienation causes, that results in an observable and material impairment in the child's growth. And I'm going to present to you some science and research on brain development or psychological functioning. All of these definitions or examples in this particular code fit and segue nice with parental alienation being psychological abuse that does cause immediate and future impairment. So let's talk about something called adverse childhood experiences, because this is one way to discuss psychological abuse. So the ACEs are a series of studies that have been conducted on literally tens of thousands of adults, and they looked at the number and nature of childhood traumas that the now adults experienced. And then they looked at the outcomes for these adults. What were the consequences? So the ACEs can be broken down into essentially 4 categories. We have abuse, neglect, household factors, and exposure to. So in red font, I indicated where parental alienation would fit. So under abuse, it's considered emotional abuse. All right. So the ACEs consider abuse to be physical, sexual, or emotional. Under neglect, physical, emotional is where parental alienation fits, or medical neglect. Those are all adverse childhood experiences. Under household factors, mental illness, we know from the research that at least in the moderate to severe end of the spectrum, the alienating parent almost always has severe psychopathology, a significant personality disorder, for example. Separation and divorce just by itself, even without alienation involved, is considered an adverse childhood experience. as well as incarceration of a parent or a parent who is struggling with substance abuse. And then finally, exposure to domestic violence. We also consider parental alienation to be a form of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So you can see across the spectrum of adverse childhood experiences in all four categories, parental alienation falls in each one of those four categories. So what does that look like when a child experiences an adverse childhood experience, one of the ACEs? Well, from the research, we know that experiencing one or more ACEs can create the toxic stress response, which I will go into here in a little bit. ACEs are considered developmental trauma. Now, trauma is a very heavy hitter as far as a word, but trauma happens on a regular basis in situations that you normally wouldn't think. Car accidents, obviously. Watching your pet get run over, obviously, that's a trauma. But interference between a parent-child relationship, as psychological abuse, is also a trauma. Toxic stress and developmental trauma contribute to the following. Here's what the ACEs studies concluded. Chronic lifelong health problems. So adults who had several ACEs compared to adults who did not experienced many more chronic lifelong health problems. They also showed a decreased lifespan, increased risky behavior, which is a brain-based function, and increased mental health diagnoses. So there were some clear distinctions between adults who experienced one or more ACEs in childhood and adults who didn't. And these are pretty profound differences between the two groups. It's not just some incendiary or maybe temporary differences. These can be lifelong, life-ending consequences. Some individuals talk about child psychological abuse as child maltreatment. So let me introduce you to that. Child maltreatment comes from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. So this is a society here in our country, and they define child maltreatment as a repeated pattern or extreme incidences of caretaker behavior that, and I put this in quote italics, thwarts the child's basic psychological needs. For example, safety, socialization, emotional development, social support, cognitive stimulation, respect, etc. So when a parent's behaviors or actions thwart those basic psychological needs, that's considered maltreatment. And what can happen is maltreatment can convey to the child that the child is worthless, somehow defective or damaged, unloved, unlovable, unwanted, primarily useful in meeting somebody else's needs, and or expendable. So it leaves the child feeling essentially very broken. So child maltreatment, again, another way to talk about child psychological abuse. What does this look like in the context of parental alienation? All right, so let me make some parallels for you. Some of the behaviors that child maltreatment describes include spurning, exploiting or corrupting the child, terrorizing the child, or being emotionally unresponsive. So let's take a look at these four categories in a little bit more detail as related to parental alienation. So let's start with spurning. Spurning involves verbal and nonverbal caregiver acts that reject and degrade a child. Most related to parental alienation, it includes, and I put this in red font, belittling, degrading, and other forms of hostile or rejecting treatment of those in significant relationships with the child, such as parents, siblings, and extended family. And so, I mean, this perfectly describes, what happens in parental alienation situations. The denigration, the belittling, the degrading remarks about one parent to the child that interferes in that parent-child relationship. That's spurning. What about exploiting or corrupting? All right. This involves the following most relevant to parental alienation: betraying the trust of, or being cruel to another person. So if a parent, the favored parent, is engaging in parental alienation tactics, that's being cruel, not only to the child, but to the other parent. What about restricting or interfering with or directly undermining the child's important relationships, including extended family and the other parent, and encouraging developmentally inappropriate behavior such as parentification or adultification of the child? There's lots of situations, especially at the severe end, or examples in which the alienating parent treats the child like a peer, a friend. The parent-child relationship hierarchy doesn't exist. That's considered maltreatment because children are not prepared developmentally, cognitively, or psychologically to be a parent's friend or confidant. Coercing the child's submission through extreme over-involvement, such as intrusiveness, which we see in parental alienation, dominance, micromanaging the child's life, or manipulating the child by inducing guilt, fostering anxiety, or threatening to withdraw love. Placing the child in a double bind or loyalty conflict, as we say in this field, in which the child is doomed to fail or disappoint, creates disorientation by telling the child something when in fact it's not true at all. So all of that to me encapsulates parental alienation, creating a false narrative, for the child about the other parent in a way that disrupts, interrupts, or destroys the relationship between the child and the other parent. The third maltreatment category that I referenced is called terrorizing. And that includes caregiver behavior that threatens or is likely to hurt a child or place a child or the child's loved ones, objects, in a recognized or dangerous situation. All right. Terrorizing includes the following, most relevant to parental alienation: subjecting the child to frightening, chaotic circumstances. All right. And alienating parents do this on a regular basis. Placing a child in a loyalty conflict by making the child unnecessarily choose one parent over the other. Again, children are not biologically wired to reject a parent. And so when the pressure is on to do that, the consequences can be quite significant, as you'll see as I move down through this presentation. What about emotionally unresponsive parents? Another child maltreatment category. So this includes caregiver behavior that ignores the child's attempts and needs to be loved and interact with adults and the family members. So with respect to parental alienation, I feel that it is most relevant to the emotional detachment and inattentiveness to the child's needs to be safe and secure. When you promote that the other parent is to be feared, you're not safe with that other parent, that parent wants to hurt you, that other parent is bad, that is promoting something that goes against the child's natural tendency to attach and love both parents. So this is child maltreatment. What about, in my field, the DSM-5? That's the manual that we use to diagnose various psychological disorders. Child psychological abuse is included in the DSM-5. It's considered a V code, 995.51, and it is as follows. Child psychological abuse is non-accidental verbal or symbolic acts by a child's parent or caregiver that results or has a reasonable potential to result in significant psychological harm to the child. So again, we can talk about this in the framework of parental alienation. A parent's behavior that results in significant psychological harm, psychological child abuse, is the very definition of this. And so just to show you that even in the field, the psychological and psychiatric field, we have a working definition of child abuse. Examples of psychological abuse of a child include berating, disparaging, or humiliating the child. Again, I'm still on the DSM-5 definition. threatening the child, harming, abandoning, or indicating that the alleged offender will harm, abandon people or things that the child cares about. And so when a parent engages in alienation behaviors and they use that manipulation of, if you really loved me, you wouldn't really want to go see your other parent. If you really loved me, you would stay here because we are the only two in this world. It's us against them. Those kinds of statements that parents make are considered psychological abuse. Again, because children are not wired for that. They are not wired to have to live in fear and reject a parent. Additional examples of psychological abuse: the egregious scapegoating of the child, coercing the child to inflict pain on him or herself, disciplining the child excessively through physical or non-physical means. And sometimes we find that alienating parents will punish the child for not aligning strongly enough with the alienating parent, failing to toe the line, so to speak. So in summary, then, from the DSM-5, our manual for diagnoses, child abuse is intentional. So it's not something that is due to lack of understanding. Parents intend to do what they do. It includes berating, threatening, or humiliating the child, and harming or threatening to harm the people and things the child cares about. And that last one is what is most relevant to parental alienation. It's interfering in that parent-child relationship with the other parent. So the question, why do some parents engage in alienation? It's a worthy question to ask. Well, in my experience, and I think the field's experience, some of what happens is just with some parents, just a general lack of understanding. So some parents use alienation tactics because they're just ignorant of the effect that it can have on children. They are from the school of thought that children are resilient and could weather essentially anything in life, that they will forget and be able to overcome through growth and development, adversity in childhood. So education is a good option for these people. And I find these people, I see them, that they are really at heart not pathological alienators. They really just don't get it. They really just don't understand. And when you use psychoeducation and introduce them to the science, that, as I'm doing today, they get it. And then they can adjust their behavior accordingly. Other parents use alienation tactics because they suffer from one of what we call the high conflict personality disorders. And I'm going to introduce you to the top two personality disorders that we find in moderate and severe alienators. And the use of alienation tactics is not through ignorance or the idea that children are just resilient and they'll, muscle through about anything in childhood. It's not even about the child. It's about the parent's pathology and the parent enacting, revenge and misery on the other parent. So the child is just the mechanism or the tool to achieve that. So let's talk about the personality disorders as a definition. So about 10% of people in this country would meet the clinical criteria for one of the 10 personality disorders. I'm only going to introduce you essentially to 4, and only 2 of those am I going to talk about in detail. But essentially, personality disorders are deeply ingrained patterns of behavior that deviate markedly from acceptable norms, our societal norms, typically apparent by the time the child is in adolescence, cause long-term difficulties in functioning, relationships, etc. So we divide the 10 personality disorders into 3 categories. So we have the disorders that avoid people. That would be paranoid personality, schizoid personality, or schizotypal. I'm not going to talk about those, but these are individuals who avoid people. All right. On the right side of your screen, these individuals avoid conflict. Avoidant personality, dependent personality and obsessive compulsive personality. All right, they are conflict adverse. So let's look at the middle, the high conflict personality disorders. There are 4 of them: antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. And I'm only going to introduce you in some detail to borderline and narcissistic because those are the frequent flyers in my experience in working in this field. So borderline personality disorders are enduring patterns of unstable moods, unstable self-image, unstable functioning, very high in dysregulation. Borderline individuals are often impulsive and unstable in relationships. They have intense and frequent episodes of anger, depression, anxiety. Again, that's that dysregulation that we see, their inability to regulate their emotional system. And it can last from just, moments to a few hours to days. So there can be a lot of cycling, between the various moods that we see. Those with borderline personality disorder, unfortunately, almost always have a history of abuse themselves. And so their own growth and development was interrupted by abuse in various forms. It could be sexual, emotional, physical, or some combination of all of those. And so as a result, they have grown into an adult with severe handicapping personality disorder. So let's take a look at what that means. Relationships are very intense, unstable, and they alternate between these extremes of over idolizing their partner and to undervaluing, their partner. And so there's nothing in the middle. It's these extremes from one end of the continuum to the other. Their emotions change very quickly, and the person experiences intense episodes of sadness, irritability, rage, anxiety, all of them on a regular cycling basis. The level of anger is often inappropriate, intense, and difficult to control. So you can imagine as a child living with a borderline parent, your life is chaotic, your life is unpredictable, and you start to experience what we call the toxic stress response. When upset, a borderline engages in recurrent suicidal behaviors or threats, gestures, self-injurious behaviors such as cutting, for example, burning, hitting oneself. There is significant and persistently unstable image of self, what the person truly believes in. Whoever they're with at the time, they tend to morph into that person's belief system. And then once that relationship ends and they start a different relationship, they morph into that person's belief system, etc. The person is very suspicious or even paranoid, at times. Others are plotting to hurt or help, injure, him or her. A little bit more about what a borderline is. The self-damaging behaviors such as excessive spending, unsafe and inappropriate sexual behavior, substance abuse, recklessness, rage, on the road, binge eating. These are just some examples. Nobody necessarily as a borderline exhibits all of those, but those are the most frequent behaviors that we would find in that particular population. They also engage in frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And so here's where parental alienation can take hold. So a relationship ends, a marriage ends, and you are married to a borderline. Well, that person is going to, the result of a separation and divorce, that is going to throw that person into a severe episode of abandonment. And so in their inability, to deal with and recover from, a relationship breaking up, they begin to pull the child in and use the child as a weapon to enact revenge against the other parent for the abandonment feelings. And so all of this notion of a borderline wanting to protect the child from a dangerous parent, et cetera, that we hear has nothing to do with the child. It's all about the borderline's inability to recover and those overwhelming feelings of abandonment and revenge. So the borderline suffers from profound feelings of emptiness and sometimes boredom. And so again, to one degree, there's some empathy for borderlines because, again, their histories were full of abuse as well, and they didn't ask for that abuse, but this is the result, and this is why alienators often have a borderline personality disorder. So in summary, just to summarize all of the slides that I showed you, a borderline's core features: very unstable emotionally, lots of emotional dysregulation, self-harm behaviors, intense emotions. All right, it's not just feeling happy, it's feeling euphoric. I mean, 9 times over the moon. Extreme abandonment issues, which plays into parental alienation when a marriage dissolves, and an unstable sense of self. They really don't have their feet grounded psychologically, and so their sense of self is just never solidified. And it's hard to function in the world if you don't have a sense of who you are, what you believe in. All right. The other frequent flyer personality disorder from the high conflict personalities would be the narcissist. And I know that narcissism is a term that is used on a regular basis now, probably too much because people don't always understand what it means. But yes, a narcissist is very self-centered, blames everybody else, belittles others, cruel, to others, exploits others for their own personal gain. They feel extremely entitled to act the way they act and believe the way they believe. They're arrogant. Essentially, they're challenging people and can be unpleasant if you have to have a narcissist in your life on a regular basis. Narcissists don't have much empathy or the ability to empathize. They lack insight. They can talk and talk and talk very intellectually, but when you start to poke holes at their level of insight, it's not very difficult to see that they don't have any. They require a great deal of admiration and adulation and attaboys. They feel special and unique. Okay, it's me and all the rest of you. They like to use intimidation as ways to control people, and they have grandiosity. They literally, truly believe that they are just bigger and better than anybody else. They're smarter than anybody else. They're more talented than anybody else. Just list something and they're better at it. So the core features of a narcissist are entitlement. They are conflict oriented. Okay, so what does this look like with parental alienation? Well, these are the individuals that like to fight. And so post-divorce, you find these individuals filing modifications to continue the fight. And one way to continue the fight is to draw the child into the arena. Because after a divorce is settled, the only thing that the two now parents divorced share is the child. The property issues have been decided, all of the other issues related to a divorce have been decided, but the court can still make changes with respect to custody, possession, and access. And so again, the child becomes weaponized. It's not about the child is in danger or the child is being abused at the other parent's home. It's about an entitled, conflict-oriented personality structure with little to no insight, who likes to exploit and needs constant adulation. So one interesting study that I wanted to present came from Amy Baker in 2012, where she looked at the commonalities between cult leaders and favored parents. And a lot of these traits are narcissistic traits. So from the cult research and literature, cult leaders are narcissistic. They require devotion by their followers. They require loyalty by their followers, adulation by their followers. They lack humility. They're very charming, persuasive. They're emotionally manipulative. They create this dependency between themselves and the followers. And it's all about power and control. Well, at the severe end of parental alienation, favored parents have exactly the same traits and qualities. And so you can see as you look down, narcissism, narcissism, require devotion, require devotion. It's the same all the way down. And so again, it's not about the child. It's not about keeping the child safe from some dangerous parent. It's about power and control. And the child is simply a mechanism. All right, let's talk about some of the consequences of child psychological abuse, aka parental alienation being one form. Toxic stress. All right. Toxic stress is real. There's lots of science and research literature discussing toxic stress. So this occurs when a child experiences a strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity, such as parental alienation, without adequate adult support. This kind of prolonged activation of the stress response in the brain can disrupt the development of the brain architecture and other organ systems, as well as increase the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment well into the adult years. So toxic stress, by definition, is not, a temporary or transient phenomena. This is something that can literally change your brain architecture. And I'll show you some additional research studies that underscore that statement. So let's talk about adversity, because that is one of the features or stimulators of toxic stress. So physical abuse is an adverse experience, as well as chronic neglect, divorce, emotional abuse, under which parental alienation falls, exposure to violence in the family structure, or a parent with a mental health diagnosis, such as one of the personality disorders. So these are all adverse experiences that can start the chain of toxic stress in the brain. So essentially, we are all hardwired to have a response to an emergency, to something that could potentially be life-threatening, and our brains will react very quickly and swiftly in order to protect us. And so the brain releases chemicals, norepinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline, for example, to help us react, to help us become laser focused and do what we need to do to eliminate the threat. However, if the threat is never eliminated, because the threat is a parent who is using alienation tactics to try and destroy the other parent's relationship with the child, toxic stress then develops. All right. Psychological disorders related to toxic stress, PTSD. All right. The brain can change in such a way that it now meets the definition or clinical criteria for PTSD. Depression, anxiety, and addictions. These all increase in frequency, and the research citation is there on the bottom right of your screen. When children have been exposed to toxic stress situations. So when the brain never shuts off the release of those chemicals that are only designed for short-term use, these are some of the potential psychological consequences of that. What about neuropsychological consequences of toxic stress? Same research study. Well, these individuals found that memory and learning was affected, executive functions were affected. Get my little arrow here. IQ and academic performance was affected. All of these decreases in performance and skills, language processing, visual spatial skills, essentially, across the board cognitively. Now, the three that I marked with an asterisk are anatomical changes that this particular research team found. So in toxic stress brains, they found a smaller prefrontal cortex and then less prefrontal white matter. And so your prefrontal cortex is right here. It is involved in the most abstract thinking, critical thinking skills, the most advanced parts of our brain are underneath our forehead. And so when you have a smaller area, that person is going to have less ability to think critically, to problem solve, to have inductive and deductive reasoning skills, analytical skills, etc. And then the other notable finding from this research team was a smaller corpus callosum. So this is an anatomical change in the brain. The corpus callosum is a bundle of fibers that moves between the right and left hemisphere and helps the two hemispheres communicate. So when that structure is smaller, the communication will be affected. It'll be less efficient, less quick, etc. And so those were pretty profound findings for me when I read this particular research article. We also know that childhood traumas that are interpersonal, which is parent-child relationship, intentional, which is the moderate and severe end, intentionally trying to alienate a child, and chronic, again, which is parental alienation. These circumstances are particularly associated with psychological and neuropsychological consequences that I just presented to you. And so it's an assumption at this point, but I think it's safe to start talking about that parental alienation puts these children at risk for the psychological and neuropsychological consequences, that I just reviewed with you. All right. What we do know, though, from another research study is when children are involved in high conflict divorces, which again don't always include alienation, but a lot of times do because high conflict, 65% of children require counseling for anxiety. So anxiety is one red flag of toxic stress. 56% developed an attachment disorder. All right, that's a red flag for the parent-child relationship being affected by alienation tactics. Half of these children had abnormal fears and phobias. Almost half became physically aggressive. That was their manifestation of the stress. They acted out. 31% had sleep disorders or disturbances, and that's a very basic function for us for survival, our sleep cycle. Followed by about a third of these children withdrew from their loved activities, and that's one characteristic of depression. Approximately a quarter of the children became oppositional and or raged, again, externalizing the stress. 21% were engaged in promiscuity, early sexual activity. 13% had regression and began bedwetting. And then 10% developed what we call a dissociative disorder, which is an indicator of severe trauma and found in other individuals from other sources of severe trauma is dissociation. The brain just literally detaches, from the experiences that are related to the trauma. So finally, just want to help you understand that psychological abuse can also result in, as adults, the following. And this is Verhar et al. 2022, so a very recent research study. So these are adults who were previously alienated as children. All right, so they are adults now looking backwards, retrospectively, and talking about, the experiences that they had and what they currently experience. 55% were experiencing depression and or anxiety. All right. 20% were having some kind of body dysmorphia or eating disorder issue. 40% had personality problems. And so, you heard me mention that borderline personality disordered individuals almost always have a history of abuse. Well, we consider parental alienation to be child psychological abuse. And so it's no wonder that the children of borderlines grow up to also exhibit the core features of borderline personality disorder. Suicidal ideation, and about a third of these now adults. Self-harm behaviors, about 15% engaged in that type of behavior. 10% presented with psychosomatic illnesses, which is, over-focusing on your body and perceived problems with your body when none exist. We have about 55% of the now adults who engaged in alcohol consumption beginning in adolescence. Okay, so very early started turning to alcohol to self-medicate. 35% were using at least marijuana as a drug. 10% had an addiction to sex or pornography. 45% felt shame and guilt as an adult, and looking backwards at their childhood. 40% struggled with self-worth. All right. 30% felt lonely and isolated. A third, of adults who came from backgrounds of parental alienation. 20% felt hopeless, helpless. Again, another red flag for depression. 60% were dealing with grief and loss. And that can include the loss of a parent-child relationship. What could have been, what should have been, as they got older and they recognized through growth and development, what had happened to them and what they lost. And then, not surprisingly, 45% were dealing with anger. Well, if you recognize that you lost a significant part of your childhood relationship with the other parent, that would definitely underscore anger. And why half of these people are dealing with anger. 15% still dealt with abandonment issues, because again, remember, at the severe end, it's not about the child. It's about the power and control and the pathology of the offending parent. And many severely alienating parents walk away, especially if the court intervenes and takes the child from their care and places them with the target parent. The severely alienating parent just walks off. That's not uncommon. So leaving that child to feel abandoned. And 50% as adults had very poor or maladaptive coping skills. All right, so growing up, conflict resolution and ways to manage difficult situations were never learned. Personality disorders ruled, and the child was just weaponized against the other parent. So finally, one other study from Amy Baker, again, that looked at previously alienated children who are now adults. She found that 70% experienced depression. In our country, 8% of our general population would meet the clinical criteria for depression. 70% of previously alienated children, now adults, were depressed. 65% struggled with self-worth and felt very poorly about themselves. 50% were alienated from their own children. Right? So there's a multi-generational effect. 40% had trust issues, which is not surprising. And then the other sobering statistic was 35% of previously alienated children struggled with addictions, compared to 10% of our general population who struggled with addictions. And so these are profound consequences for child psychological abuse by way of parental alienation. So as I leave you today, these are my key points, my takeaway points for you. Parental alienation is a form of child psychological abuse. I hope that you were able to follow my thought processes and the science and research that I use to support that statement. Even children who are abused want a relationship with the abusive parent. They just don't want the abuse. It is just so difficult to go against the attachment that is hardwired into all of us, the attachment to your caregivers. Children are not biologically wired to reject a parent, as I just said. Some parents who alienate just don't understand the impact of their actions. Those parents are recoverable through education. Other parents who alienate have severe psychopathology. I only discussed two, which are frequent flyers, that be borderline and narcissism. And regardless, toxic stress is one potential outcome for the child. All right, this effect of alienation creates that toxic stress response, as well as psychological disorders, neuropsychological consequences, etc. So I want to thank you for allowing me to present to you on this very important issue. And if you have any questions or comments, I know that Elaine will provide my contact information. Thank you.